"I'll talk where I dashed well want to, madam," Mr. Jenkins said. "Come on now, out with it. If Bruno has broken a window or smashed your spectacles, then I'll pay for the damage, but I'm not budging out of this seat." One or two other groups in the room were beginning to stare at us now. "Where is Bruno, anyway?" Mr. Jenkins said. "Tell him to come here and see me." "He's here already," my grandmother said. "He's in my handbag." She patted the big floppy leather bag with her walking stick. "What the heck do you mean he's in your handbag?" Mr. Jenkins shouted. "Are you trying to be funny?" Mrs. Jenkins said, very prim. "There's nothing funny about this," my grandmother said. "Your son has suffered a rather unfortunate mishap." "He's always suffering mishaps," Mr. Jenkins said. "He suffers from overeating, and then he suffers from wind. You should hear him after supper. He sounds like a brass band. But a good dose of castor oil soon puts him right again. Where is the little beggar?" "I've already told you," my grandmother said. "He's in my handbag. But I do think it might be better if we went somewhere private before you meet him in his present state." "This woman's mad," Mrs. Jenkins said. "Tell her to go away." "The plain fact is," my grandmother said, "that your son Bruno has been rather drastically altered." "Altered?" shouted Mr. Jenkins. "What the devil do you mean, altered?" "Go away," Mrs. Jenkins said. "You're a silly old woman." "I am trying to tell you as gently as I possibly can that Bruno really is in my handbag," my grandmother said. "My own grandson actually saw them doing it to him." "Saw who doing what to him, for heaven's sake?" shouted Mr. Jenkins. He had a black moustache which jumped up and down when he shouted. "Saw the witches turning him into a mouse," my grandmother said. "Call the manager, dear," Mrs. Jenkins said to her husband. "Have this madwoman thrown out of the hotel." At this point, my grandmother's patience came to an end. She fished around in her handbag and found Bruno. She lifted him out and dumped him on the glass-topped table. Mrs. Jenkins took one look at the fat little brown mouse, who was still chewing a bit of banana, and she let out a shriek that rattled the crystals on the chandelier. She sprang out of her chair, yelling, "It's a mouse! Take it away! I can't stand the things!" "It's Bruno," my grandmother said. "You nasty, cheeky old woman!" shouted Mr. Jenkins. He started flapping his newspaper at Bruno, trying to sweep him off the table. My grandmother rushed forward and managed to grab hold of him before he was swept away. Mrs. Jenkins was still screaming her head off, and Mr. Jenkins was towering over us, shouting, "Get out of here! How dare you frighten my wife like that? Take your filthy mouse away this instant!" "Help!" screamed Mrs. Jenkins. Her face had gone the colour of the underside of a fish. "Well, I did my best," my grandmother said, and with that she turned and sailed out of the room, carrying Bruno with her.